I mean, what's happened for now is with China in particular, the rest of the world was going to get a 10% tariff and then China a 30% tariff, or sorry, 145%, but that got scaled back to China getting a 30% tariff, which is a significant increase. Basically, in 2018, the tariff was like 3.5%, something like that. And then Trump raised it to like 10%, 12%. Then it went up to 21%, 19%. And it stayed there under Biden. So, we had gone in the span of like a few years to from like 3% to 20%. And then Trump was talking about raising it to like 145% and then backed off. But now it's 30%, which is more, than the 20% that it had been for a number of years. Where is all this coming from? One aspect of the story that I think has been underreported is the role of the influence of this guy, Peter Navarro. And he's the subject of our discussion for today because I think in understanding what is going on with Trump at more of an immediate level within the cabinet, the plans of the capitalist class overall notwithstanding, this is the guy who is Trump's tariff guru, as the article says. So this is an article, how Peter Navarro went from Democrat to inmate to Trump's tariff guru. It's a wild story. This guy is one of the most twisted and bizarre figures, I think, of recent politics. He comes off to me as like Willie Loman as played by Bryan Cranston. A bizarre figure, and we're going to watch some video of him later. But let's get into this article for a minute. Now Navarro has a prime seat in the Oval Office, where he is an architect of President Donald Trump's tariff policy, butting against the Secretaries of Treasury and Commerce and Elon Musk, who called him a, quote, moron. I think he also said he was like dumber than a bag of hammers and stuff like that. But Musk is actually, according to Elon Musk, he would like to see zero tariffs on any country. Navarro has a decidedly different perspective. Navarro's journey to one of the most powerful positions in the White House has been one of spectacular flameouts and surprising comebacks. He tried to launch a similar tariff war in the first Trump administration, but lost influence before the inauguration, according to his own account. This time, he vowed it would be different, and the results have been explosive. A trembling stock market, trillions of dollars in losses, and the threat of recession. To Navarro, all is going according to his plan. Quote, "This is unfolding exactly like we thought it would in a dominant scenario," he said April 13 on NBC's Meet the Press, predicting the Dow Jones Industrial Average would soar. But critics say that Navarro, 75, has aligned with Trump to enact policies that could set back the United States for years to come, regardless whether the president wins some concessions. So this is really the mastermind behind these particular things, and it's coming from a place of anti-China zealotry, as we will demonstrate. Mark Zandi, the chief economist of Moody's, said that the policy is so, quote, egregiously bad that it could, quote, wreck the economy. And according to the appeal, it is back on the menu for now. Zandi said that while economic consensus on anything is rare, in this case, he doubted whether even 1 out of 100 economists would agree with Navarro's approach, but Trump does. Quote, and I think at this time, the 145 thing was still out there. This was before they scaled back to 10%. Why even do that, though, in the first? Why even shock people with that in the first place? While others in the administration may have privately pushed back, there's nothing like the opposition Navarro faced in the first term, when he also served as a trade advisor, Zandi said. The story of how this one-time staunch Democrat has won so much influence has become a defining tale of the early days of the second Trump administration, raising concerns even among many Republicans about how the economist has gained such extraordinary power. An examination of Navarro's memoirs, interviews, and other documentation shows that it is a war he has sought for decades. The enemy is not only China, he has said, but also the Wall Street titans who have benefited from Beijing's policies, so China sympathizers, I guess, powerful corporate heads who chose deliberately to collaborate with China. That's also, he considers the enemy, if you watch his Death by China video, who benefited from Beijing's policies and who notably are among the most powerful players in the Republican Party, including some now in Trump's cabinet. If Navarro's battles in the current Trump administration are anything like they were in the first term, they're filled with shouting matches, name-calling, and endless effort to curry the president's favor. Navarro and the White House did not respond to a request for comment. From Clinton to MAGA, little in Navarro's background suggested that he would be at the center of White House discussions that could determine the nation's future. Navarro was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and spent part of his childhood living with his mother in a garage apartment in Palm Beach, Florida, near a mansion owned by the Kennedy family, before moving to the Washington area and attending Maryland's Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. After attending Tufts University, his liberal leanings led him to join the Peace Corps, serving from 1973 to 6 as a volunteer in Thailand, the agency confirmed via email. Navarro recalled listening to Voice of America and hearing Jimmy Carter run for president on his message of hope, he told the San Diego Union Tribune. After earning a master's degree in public administration and a PhD in economics at Harvard, he moved in 1981 to San Diego, where his early career was marked by his criticism of tariffs. In his 1984 book, The Policy Game, How Special Interests and Ideologues Are Stealing America, Navarro warned that, quote, as history has painfully taught, once protectionist wars begin, the likely result is a deadly and well-nigh unstoppable downward spiral by the entire world economy. Interesting. Navarro became politically active and ran in a number of San Diego races. His main issue was limiting the number of houses in the city, and by extension the number of immigrants. He advanced in a 1992 primary for mayor, but lost the general election. Then, in 1996, he ran for Congress and spoke at the Democratic National Convention. I'm proud to be carrying the Clinton-Gore banner, Navarro said, referring to the ticket of Bill Clinton and Al Gore. But while Democrats retained the White House, Navarro lost his race. Gradually, Navarro underwent a political radicalization. Instead of focusing on housing, utility regulation, and zoning, he had a much bigger target, China. Navarro wrote in one of his several memoirs that he had an epiphany while teaching economics and public policy at the University of California at Irvine. He noticed that students who had earned a master's degree in business administration were having a hard time getting and keeping good jobs. Navarro wrote that after investigating why his students were unemployed, he concluded that all roads began leading to Beijing. Reborn as a trade hawk, he wrote that China was able to flood the U.S. with cheap goods, quote, thereby beginning to put Americans like my MBA students out of work. And this is just where it begins. This is like truly his villain origin story. Navarro turned his new way of thinking into a series of anti-China books. Some, including Death by China, relied on a supposed expert named Ron Vara, who Navarro later acknowledged was fake, and Ron Vara is an anagram of his name Navarro. You can't make this up, one day during Trump's first run for the presidency, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, happened upon Navarro's work. As Kushner told it in his memoir, Breaking History, he liked the thesis of Death by China so much that he hired the eccentric former professor as the Trump campaign's trade advisor. So literally, I don't know if they're going to go into more detail on that. They're not. This was actually covered in a number of places, but basically Trump literally was like, you need somebody who like knows what he's doing. You need like an important sounding advisor. Go find somebody. And so Kushner literally went on Amazon.com in the book section and just looked for books with titles that sounded cool. Death by China was suitable. And so he just called the guy up cold and was like, how'd you like to be my new advisor? Boom. That's how this alliance was formed. I shit you not. Continuing the article, by Navarro's account in his 2022 memoir, he was strolling on Victoria Beach near his home in Laguna Beach, California, when he got a call from Trump's then speechwriter, Stephen Miller. The two talked about an upcoming Trump speech in Pittsburgh that blamed globalization for the shuttering of steel mills. By Navarro's account, the speech was pure MAGA magic, referring to the Trump slogan, Make America Great Again, and Trump, who had long spoken harshly of trade deals, was smitten. Navarro was given an office on the 14th floor of Trump Tower, where he worked on economic plans that focused heavily on launching a trade war, well, it says with, but really against China. After Trump won the election, he named Navarro director of the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. Navarro had an ally not only in Miller. Miller, by the way, is a complete fascist fanatic. When the court ruled against them, as we were just showing yesterday, Stephen Miller referred to it as a judicial coup. The judicial coup has gone so far. One of the people, there were 3 judges involved in that decision. One of them was a Trump appointee, another a Reagan appointee, and I forget who the third one was appointed by. But that's how they, respond when they don't get what they want. Oh, it's a judicial coup. Give me a break. You got a ruling you didn't like. It's insane. But anyway, but also in Trump's chief strategist, Stephen K. Bannon, a former Goldman Sachs investment banker who had once profited from globalism but turned against it after becoming convinced that the U.S. was at economic war with China. He read Navarro's China books and used his influence with Trump to push Navarro's views. I have to say, by the way, I've watched Death by China start to finish. I have skimmed through the book, which is very similar to the movie. It is laughably exaggerated claims. Now, it could be that a little while ago, products from China were somewhat less safe than they are now. But it was literally like every toy out of China is going to kill your kids. All the food coming out of China is completely tainted, etc. I mean, 13 years have passed since that book came out. The world has not ended, but incredible. Bannon, in an interview at his Capitol Hill townhouse, recalled how Trump's top advisors were arguing against tariffs during a 2017 meeting at Mar-a-Lago. "Where's my Peter?" Trump said. Statement that could be interpreted in a few ways, according to Bannon, who then brought him into the room to argue for tariffs. Bannon said that Navarro is often mocked and that his place in Trump's orbit is underestimated. Bannon said that Navarro, and you'll see why he's mocked and underestimated when we watch a few clips of him talking. It's ridiculous. He can't stay on topic. Just a pathetic, shambling husk of a man. But anyway, Bannon said that Navarro is one of the few people who have been by Trump's side during 3 campaigns and 2 administrations, and that he reinforces Trump's decades-long belief in tariffs. Quote, "When people say he has gone too far, this is not Peter Navarro's agenda," Bannon said. "This is Donald Trump's. It dovetails. This is a core conviction of Trump," unquote. In one of his books, In Trump Time, in 2021, Navarro wrote that he urged Trump to go full sudden Zen and launch the all-out trade war against China. But, Navarro wrote, he was a, quote, one-man China hawk, totally without power or allies, in a White House filled with a symphony of Wall Street transactionalists and China dove appeasers. So you can start to get the picture here of how Navarro is trying to change the tone on China. Among Navarro's enemies was Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who held senior positions at Goldman Sachs and whom Navarro accused without evidence of having, quote, made millions from communist China. Mnuchin could not be reached for comment. Navarro also battled repeatedly with National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn, former president of Goldman Sachs, who Navarro wrote was, quote, one of the worst and most treacherous misfits of the entire Trump administration. Cohn, now vice chairman of IBM, declined to comment. After leaving his White House position, Cohn said in 2019 that among economists he knew about, Navarro was the, quote, only one in the world who thought tariffs worked. Quote, tariffs don't work. If anything, they hurt the economy because if you're a typical American worker, you have a finite amount of income to spend, Cohn said in an interview with the Freakonomics radio program. More recently, Cohn has stressed in television appearances that tariffs can be a key bargaining instrument for a president against a country that is subsidizing a product, but he warned in September that improper use of tariffs on goods the U.S. does not produce. In other words, the U.S. is not even competing. You know, there's things you can't grow in the United States agriculturally. There's things that you can't fish in the United States, like the fish don't live here, you know, etc. There's also things that entire supply chains that we just don't really have in the U.S. If you're not competing directly, the tariffs make no sense because there is no competing U.S. product. You're just relying on an international supply chain, and you just have to, like, suck it up. They don't want to suck it up. They want to impose the tariffs now, even though there's not a competing U.S. product, and then just figure it out later. Oh, the factories will magically appear here in this country. This is the whole, they're going to re-onshore thing. No, they're fucking not, because it doesn't make any sense to do that when you're going to spend tens of millions of dollars to set up a factory here in the U.S., and then if they repeal the tariffs, suddenly you're not competitive anymore, and you just wasted all that money. So who's going to do that? They're obviously going to just wait out the tariffs rather than onshoring most of the stuff. So it's probably going to have a negligible impact overall. But it will raise prices because who pays tariffs? The importing company, the importer, pays the tariff. And of course, businesses pass on cost. They don't just eat it. And of course, that's been a thing recently. Trump's accusing the companies who raised their prices because of the tariffs of engaging in a, quote, political act. Are you fucking kidding, dude? That's basic business. So he's basically saying, like, oh, you're a traitor to your country because we're doing these tariffs for the good of the country. If you raise your prices instead of just eating it, then you're like a traitor to the country. This is so not going to work. It's incredible. But anyway, let's continue. But he warned in September that improper use of tariffs on goods the U.S. does not produce, quote, would just be debilitating to our economy. Yeah. Wilbur Ross, who served as Commerce Secretary in the first Trump administration and pushed back against some of Navarro's tariff proposals, was vilified in a Navarro memoir because he would, quote, stick stilettos in my back. You know what? I am going to finish this one. Fascinating article, actually. I mean, it makes some of the crazy make sense. You know what I mean? Now Ross is watching Navarro's influence on Trump's second term without voices of caution. And that causes him concern, he said in an interview with the Washington Post. Quote, I think it's always good for the president to be exposed to a variety of opinions, especially on as crucial a topic as tariffs, Ross told the Post. And so I think it would be far preferable if there were other strong voices in the administration advancing, if not contrary views, at least views addressing some of the details. Because again, there's this sort of like wild-eyed fanaticism behind this push. And I mean, when they were saying 145% tariffs, that would have been a complete breakdown of global trade. And, you know, there were people engaging in like panic buying because of that. It's totally destabilizing. Even 30% tariffs are going to significantly, and they made some exceptions for like electronics or whatever, but like it's going to cause significant price increases at a time when the entire refrain during the Biden administration, those years, the pandemic years, was inflation's out of control. Now you want to add a structural factor increasing it. Wow. Navarro concluded that a second Trump administration was his best chance to realize his tariff policy goals. Few would work harder to embrace Trump's claim that the 2020 election was stolen from him. So he's trying to suck up to Trump in the off season when Biden got into power. Navarro had worked on a plan called the Green Bay Sweep, in which Republicans would maneuver to send the counting of 2020 electoral votes back to state legislatures, which Navarro believed could end up approving electors who would declare Trump the winner. The plan was never enacted because Vice President Mike Pence refused to go along, which led Navarro to write that he was a, quote, traitor. This is the level, the hyperbole, the exaggeration these people have to cast everything that happens in their world on, because it's all about Trump's ego and the high drama of it all, and how he has to be, coddled and made to feel special. If you disagree, you're not just disagreeing, it's treason, etc. In his memoir, Taking Back Trump's America, published in 2022, Navarro made little noticed complaints about how Trump managed trade in the first administration and ran for re-election. Describing what he called Trump's Achilles heel, Navarro wrote, quote, I would tell you in a nanosecond that it is bad personnel choices. Criticizing Trump for surrounding himself with a confederacy of globalists, never Trump Republicans, this part's a quote, wild-eyed Freedom Caucus nut jobs, that's rich, and self-absorbed Wall Street transactionalists who didn't understand Trump's working-class voters. Moreover, Navarro wrote, it was, quote, unforgivable for Trump to have failed to make China the most important issue of his 2020 campaign. Newsflash, most people don't give a shit. Calling it, quote, one of the greatest missed opportunities in presidential campaign history. Navarro, meanwhile, was indicted in June 2022 for refusing to comply with a subpoena from the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The lawmakers called on him to provide a deposition and documents about his knowledge of the events surrounding the assault. Navarro asserted that he could not comply because Trump had invoked executive privilege. Again, this is part of the sucking up so that he would get a good position in the second administration. As his trial began in September 2023, he told reporters that he expected to face legal bills of $750,000. Do I look like a rich man? Navarro said. This is the same suit I wore in 2017 going into the White House, okay? Navarro later said that Trump helped pay $300,000 and he raised more in an appeal on a website that lists anonymous gifts and some named contributors. The website says at the top, no need for more donations now. The Trump administration has not responded to a request by the Post for Navarro's financial disclosure report. Navarro was found guilty, the judge having found that he failed to prove the existence of a conversation or invocation of privilege by Trump about that. So Navarro got a 4-month sentence in a Miami federal prison starting in March 2024. On the same day that he was released from prison, Navarro arrived at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, where he said, the J6 committee demanded that I betray Donald John Trump to save my own skin. I refused. 28 years after he spoke at the Democratic National Convention and bashed Republicans, he told the GOP gathering that Democrats come from your kids. They are indoctrinating them with poisonous attitudes on race and gender. Navarro added, I went to prison so you won't have to. I am your wake-up call. On Election Day, America will hold these lawfare jackals accountable. By the way, on his YouTube page for Death by China now, he also has a thing about why Israel has to invade Gaza, etc. I've been called worse. A pair of prosecutors, Elizabeth Alloy and John Crabb Jr., said during Navarro's case that he acted as if he were above the law. After Trump was reelected, Ed Martin, a loyalist who was named interim U.S. attorney for D.C., demoted Alloy and Crabb and 5 other top prosecutors to low-level positions. They could not be reached for comment. Bannon, who also went to prison for contempt of Congress, said Trump feels a, quote, very special bond with Bannon and Navarro because of the court cases. Trump announced in December on social media that Navarro, who was, quote, treated horribly by the deep state, would be his senior counselor for trade and manufacturing, a post that put him in a position to push his tariff war. And that's why we've been seeing it. Navarro predicted that the tariffs would raise $6 trillion. The Post's fact-checker said that credible analyses put the figure at half that much or less. The extent of Navarro's tariff prescription appears at odds with the view of someone who worked closely with him. So you can see it goes on. I'm just skimming this now for any other highlights before we move on to the next thing. But I think that this background is important to understand. This guy is just some crackpot. As you can see, if you watch Death by China or read it, in which Navarro claims that the U.S. must claim the moon before China does, claim the moon for the U.S. before China claims it for itself, and many other incredibly hyped up things that he says in that book. I mean, this is the guy, and he's now extremely close to Trump, and that's where the tariff stuff is coming from, as we'll see in some of the interviews that I'm about to play. Anyway, finishing this out, Navarro opposed a proposal, according to people familiar with the matter, who spoke on the condition of anonymity. The next week, Trump agreed to temporarily exempt electronics from Chinese import duties under pressure from Apple CEO Tim Cook, another plan that Navarro had resisted as weakening the tariff policy. So he's resisting any softening of the tariffs. He wants to go fucking nuclear on these tariffs. Navarro has tested the limits of his power by seeming to go out of his way to antagonize Musk, asserting that the world's richest person relies on China for his Tesla business. Tesla could lose much from Navarro's style of trade war. China is the second largest market for the electric vehicle company, and Tesla's Shanghai factory produced its 3 millionth car in October. Musk did not respond to a request for comment. Navarro appeared to speak dismissively about Musk in a CNBC interview, calling him a car assembler, not a car manufacturer, because many Tesla components come from China and other countries. Musk was outraged, launching attacks against Navarro on Twitter after writing that Navarro's PhD in economics from Harvard was, quote, a bad thing, not a good thing. He posted that Navarro was, quote, truly a moron, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks, and saying things that were, quote, demonstrably false. This is, of course, coming from the guy who compared the habitability of Mars to California, but okay. While some of the tariffs have been paused, the U.S. is currently imposing tariffs of 145% on Chinese products, again later dropped to 30%, then struck down completely. That striking down is currently on appeal, so we're still back to 30%, in an unprecedented financial escalation with Beijing that reflects Navarro's influence. Appearing on NBC's Meet the Press on April 13, Navarro insisted that his relationship with Musk was, quote, great, adding, I've been called worse, and truly a moron, and so on. So that's some background on Peter Navarro. In my opinion, this guy isn't getting nearly enough attention. Yes, obviously Trump's the one with the real power, but this is the guy. If you want to understand where the tariffs are coming from, it's super consistent, completely consistent with what Navarro has been saying since Death by China in 2012. Again, you can find articles on this guy, each of which is going to give you like a bit of a different piece, you know, slightly different angle, a few different quotes. What I want to go into, though, is he did write these books. I'll show you a picture of Death by China. He also did another one. There it is on Amazon. Death by China, Confronting the Dragon, A Global Call to Action. It's on LibGen. Ridiculous book. But if you look at the movie, which is narrated by Martin Sheen and has a lot of otherwise seemingly respectable people, you can see it's got a 5.4 out of 10. Not exactly doing that well. You can find it on YouTube. It's full of such hyperbole. It's hard to even communicate. But we can get a sense, actually, by looking at some of his interviews directly. So that's what I'll take you into right now. And again, just the fallout from this. People were talking about there were going to be empty shelves by May. The ports on the West Coast were drying up. This was all because of the tariff thing. I mean, people were preparing for actual shortages. And then they were just like, we're just negotiating. Like, fuck you. You know what I mean? All right. So I actually did a huge amount of background on this. More than really anybody should. Watch this interview. Peter Navarro says U.S. has no defense other than tariffs. I'm not going to play this video. I will play some clips from the later ones. So here's some of the highlights. He says, quote, we have a strategy here in relation to so-called non-tariff cheating, where the president says we're going to charge them what they charge us, meaning these other countries. And the analytical issue is it's easy to calculate the tariff differential, but the non-tariff barriers are so much higher. That's really key. This is a core thing that Navarro keeps coming back to, is the quote-unquote non-tariff cheating. In other words, a country might have like a 10% tariff on U.S. goods, but according to Navarro, they engage in all kinds of non-tariff cheating, which actually results in like the equivalent of a 70 or 80% tariff. Now, his calculations for that vary. I mean, as far as the credibility of them. But that's why they came up with such high figures. And then, of course, it looked like they used ChatGPT to actually come up with the figures. It factors in, when calculating the non-tariff cheating, it factors in the trade imbalance, which is not an emergency, which they're claiming it is. So that's a core thing, is the non-tariff cheating. They're talking about 90 deals in 90 days. It's been over 50 days at this point. There have been very few deals. When Navarro was asked about no exemptions, no exclusions, which is not the case, because that was originally the statement that there were not going to be any exemptions or exclusions, which there immediately were for electronics and other things. He deflects and starts ranting about fentanyl and computer chips. They just could not get an answer out of him. He also said that there would be day one inflation reduction. But now they're talking about the transition costs. The transition from what to what? Well, the way that things had been to some future reindustrialized United States, which apparently these tariffs are going to bring about. So again, one of the main issues was the price of eggs and food in general and housing and everything else and jobs. Those were the issues that when you actually talk to voters, what they cared about. And of course, Trump ran on, we're going to make everybody money, everybody's going to be rich, prices are going to come down, etc. But they then backed off of the day one inflation reduction. Now talking about a transition cost. And when asked about this, he didn't give a straight answer yet again. When asked how many countries is the administration currently negotiating with, at this point, and this was in April. He said the UK, the EU, India, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and Israel. That's not a lot of countries. About China, he said, quote, "We have opened up our invitation to them." So obviously China was not rushing the table. Now, they did have some preliminary negotiations with China, and they've agreed to come back to the table at a future date. That is what resulted in the pause of the 145% tariff. So they're going to be doing negotiation with China again in the future. What's going to be the outcome of that? We have no idea. Are they going to be like, well, now it's 200% tariffs? Could be. We really don't know. It has already disrupted shipments of goods to the U.S. and not to the benefit of anybody in the U.S. Navarro also was quoted as saying in this interview, China has killed over 1 million people with their fentanyl. China has taken over 60,000 of our factories. Really, how did they take them? Pretty sure that the factories willingly moved over there, but okay. Over 5 million manufacturing jobs. As we speak, every American is subject to hacking, and the conflict we're having with China cannot be understated. So this is, again, the overall picture Navarro's trying to paint. And what's the solution? Well, something that you hear him and Bessent say again and again is they want China to move to a more domestic consumption-driven economy and, quote, stop being the predator of the world. The hypocrisy here is unfathomable. But again, if you watch Death by China, the 2012 documentary, it's just laden with it. Actually, you know what? I will play you a really quick clip from the companion series to Death by China, which is called Crouching Tiger, not to be confused with the movie.
About famously, that suggests that a rising power is going to challenge an established power, and the established power is going to be afraid of that and try to take steps to prevent it.
The Chinese will try and best us, and we will try and best them, much the way the United States and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War.
But is the world really doomed to a replay of the dark and dangerous decades of the Cold War? The answer to that question may ultimately hinge on revealing what the actual intentions of a rapidly militarizing China really are. If, on the one hand, a peacefully rising China seeks only to protect its homeland and the global trade routes it needs to prosper, these unquestionably good intentions should give the world little to fear. But if an expansionist China also seeks to push the United States military out of the Asia-Pacific and then seize both territory and natural resources from its neighbors, these decidedly hegemonic intentions may well lead to a very big conflict.
Okay, so let me just stop you right there. One of the negative things China could do is listed as drive U.S. out of Asia Pacific. Last time I checked, the U.S. is not an Asian country. Why is the U.S. in the Asian Pacific region? Again, that's the entire tone of this whole thing. And the sense I get from watching the video, Death by China, and this companion series, which this is like a 12-part series of 45-minute episodes. Crouching Tiger, you can see it down there at the bottom, crouchingtiger.net. You can find it on YouTube, though. It sounds to me like flailing. It sounds to me like how much he's hyping up the threat of this. I think he believes they can't do anything about it. I think that they believe they've already lost. And a lot of this is like a ceremonial after the fact demonstration that the U.S. didn't go down without a fight. We'll move on to the next interview. All right, next thing I watched, this was an ABC News interview. This guy is so ridiculous. I would encourage you to like watch a couple of live interviews. Well, I'll play a clip later, but there's something about the way this guy talks, which is just, he's so deflated, and he just, whenever challenged, he just moves on to other subjects. It's the most pathetic thing you can really think of. Anyway, in this interview, we got some quotes. We're going to get a great deal for America and a great deal for the world. When asked how much of a role did the stock market play in this decision, quote, none. That was the answer. Also, quote, every country around the world cheats us. Yeah, that's right, the U.S., the country that's been overthrowing dozens of elected governments around the world. That, you know, that USA, that... They're trying to play the victim. It's amazing. Are we talking about the same United States here? Every country around the world cheats us. Well, the tide turns today, he's quoted as saying. And the trade war has been, quote, not against them, but them against us. So trying to frame this as China's had a trade war against the U.S. They're just really, fighting back, that's all. When asked what the end goal is, quote, the end goal is to have production here in the U.S. Good fucking luck. There's no way that they can possibly believe that that is going to be an outcome here. Anyway, when asked what is the specific goal with China, here are the quotes. China cheats us in every possible way, so that's a challenge. China uses other countries to transship to evade tariffs. So transshipping is where you ship to another country where there's lower tariffs on that country, then you have them ship. And so they claim like China ships a lot of things to Vietnam, then they're shipped from Vietnam to the U.S. to evade tariffs. So they're trying to raise tariffs to like combat that. Dumping of products from communist China into our markets is the problem. We've got to get back to a world where trade is fair. Again, completely neglecting the role of the U.S. in making, trade at at gunpoint for decades and decades. The best thing China can do is not just stop cheating, but develop its own domestic markets. That is the constant refrain here. They don't like that China is exporting so much stuff. They're like, just sell it to your own people, literally just telling them how to run their economy. And Chinese people aren't allowed to spend, they're forced to save. This will go down in American history as the greatest trade negotiating day we've ever had. And there's been a commitment from over 70 countries to come to the table and take down their trade barriers. And they're making a custom suit deal for each country. When asked about non-tariff cheating, he describes it as, quote, currency manipulation, dumping, export subsidies, VAT taxes. VAT taxes are not specific to imports, and any video where he mentions the VAT tax as being a form of cheating, he is derided in the comments on that video as having no clue what he's talking about. It's really interesting, actually, how you claim VAT taxes are non-tariff cheating against the United States. VAT taxes are like just there to screw the U.S. Phony technical and agricultural standards that keep our products out, transshipping that China does. And so it sounds to me like the U.S. wants to dictate all of the world's terms. He's saying that the technical and agricultural standards that keep U.S. products out are just phony. Like they're just set up to keep U.S. products out. They're not sincere, etc. Would love to hear the case for that. When asked, is this whole scenario playing out as you anticipated? This is like a few weeks ago. I'd wanted to cover this sooner, but it was so up and down. I just kind of put it on hold. We did the Bernie thing instead. And I'm glad I did because now we can see there's already been one court ruling against it. This thing is far from settled at this point. Anyway, is it playing out as Navarro anticipated? Quote, yes, exactly. And he says, quote, reciprocity means we charge them what they've been charging us, if you say so. He also says, what other structural changes is the U.S. going to make to try to bring the business back? That's a major question is like, okay, you put these tariffs up and it's going to cost a lot of people money. What else are you doing to try to reindustrialize? Quote, we are about to pass the biggest and broadest tax cut in American history, which will be funded in significant part by the tariff revenues. And what that will do is that will be our insurance policy against recession. Really, because all that money is going to trickle down. It's crazy. Poor people don't pay that much tax in the first place. You can cut it to nothing and we still wouldn't have that much more money. He also adds that they're going to lower oil prices via what? Deregulation. That's the insurance policy against inflation. So they're going to fucking deregulate. So what's really interesting about that is if you go back to Death by China in 2012, one of the big complaints that they make is that China didn't have the same pollution standards and labor laws. So like the US companies could move to China and face lower labor costs and they could pollute and this and that. Well, if you're deregulating here, then the same thing is going to be happening here. So anyway, that's their solution. When we talk about needing to move on from capitalism, this is what we're talking about because this is all it's going to give you is just this race to the bottom. When confronted about the time it's going to take to re-onshore the industry, quote, it's not going to take years, really. We'll do this in Trump time, which means as quickly as possible. He then makes a comparison, which he does in several interviews, to the production of N95 masks during the pandemic at Honeywell and General Motors. But he's trying to compare the production of one product during a public health crisis to restructuring the entire U.S. supply chain on an emergency basis that, quote, will not take years, and probably doing lots of deregulation. That's their whole prescription here. And so the assumption that he's making on export-dependent countries, as he describes them, is that they have nowhere to go but the U.S. That already was shown not to be the case when China was not selling into the U.S. during the 145% tariff period, which was active for a few weeks. China's actual overall sales went up 8%, and they were doing more business with other people. They actually don't need, like, that's a drastic miscalculation if you're relying on China to, just need the U.S. Actually, the U.S. needs China a lot more than China needs the U.S., so that's a terrible calculation. Also, saying that the dollar strengthens as the trade deficit lightens, meaning that the U.S. has more purchasing power to buy the imports. Quote, the end game is to have production here. But again, do countries really want to set up factories in the U.S. just to sell in the U.S., or are they just going to start writing off the U.S. and saying, we'll sell to Europe, we'll sell to Africa, we'll sell to South America, we'll sell somewhere else? Quote, just trust in Trump. That's a Navarro quote. So there's another interview where he's talking about a level playing field in the international environment. Okay, are you going to stop invading countries and overthrowing their governments? That's the sort of elephant in the room here that they continually do not address. And talking about how the reason for the tariffs on Canada and Mexico is the fentanyl that's coming in from China through Canada and Mexico. Really, I thought it was the non-tariff cheating. But anyway, that's the reason stated for the tariffs on Canada and Mexico is the fentanyl. Again, as far as combating inflation, drill baby drill, deregulation, and tax cuts. That is the verbatim quote, drill baby drill, deregulation, tax cuts. Also, here's another quote, tariffs will cause China to reduce prices. Let me put the screenshot from this one up. Tariffs will cause China to reduce prices. I just don't even... It's still going to be cheaper to buy from China, even with 30% tariffs. I did a lot of research on this topic. That's one thing I kept coming back to repeatedly, was it's still, like, even with these tariffs, it's going to raise prices, but it still doesn't make it cost effective to get a lot of the products. Where you can even get products from somewhere other than China, it's still more cost effective to buy them from China and just pay the tariff. But there's another quote, this is not just a drug war, it's a terrorism war and a border invasion war. Then he's asked the question, are there metrics you're using to figure out how the tariffs are working and where you need to push for more? Quote, negotiations, not my department, and then he refers to Rubio, etc. There's no fucking plan. They're just going to do the tariffs, assume that they're working exactly as he intends, which already people are pointing out it's likely not to work the way that he's saying. And there's no metric for determining whether they worked or not. So expect more bullshit from this guy and from Trump. Although another quote from that interview, we're moving at warp speed. It's going to be a golden age for Americans. This is the language he's using. It's just so disconnected from reality. And I don't know who he thinks is believing it at this point. I'm enjoying this. So let's actually continue. There's another interview, and then I'll play a clip after this one. This is from Peter Navarro reacts to Trump tariff confusion. They had him doing this round of media stuff. This is from Bloomberg. People are like, Peter, what the fuck is going on? So the first 2 minutes of this, I made a note, are hilarious. He's asked about Canada and Mexico, and then starts rambling about digital service taxes in France. Let me go ahead and play that.
Are these tariffs still set to take effect next week? Is March 4th the deadline? And what specifically could Canada and Mexico do to keep them from taking effect?
Well, first of all, in order to understand the trajectory of the president's trade policy, I'd urge everyone watching this show, and presumably most are investors, to read the presidential memorandum of day one of this administration, which lays out all the different types of actions. As for today, I was sitting, as you said, right behind the president. I thought he was quite clear in what he was going to do. For me, I came out here hoping to discuss this week's trade actions kind of in my lane. We did two really important things, which for investors really are market moving in the sense. The first was the digital service tax action we took. The president has directed the U.S. Trade Representative to resume action on these digital service taxes. And for the benefit of your viewers, a digital service tax is something that was effectively invented in France in 2019. It's a tax on things like cloud computing, digital advertising, all of that. But it was done in a way in France which only targeted American companies, specifically the big ones like Amazon, Google, Meta, Netflix, and Microsoft. And essentially, the president back in 2019 saw immediately that this was both a punishment in a discriminatory way of American companies, but also a tax grab from the U.S. Treasury. And so the way that works is these digital taxes are put on and they go on revenues. What that does is reduce profits, then reduce like stock prices, and then also reduce revenues from the corporate tax. And
what about Canada and Mexico?
With respect to digital service taxes, well, Canada has one. Mexico does not.
No, not in reference to that. That was not the fucking question. This is Navarro. If you haven't seen him before, this is him being relatively composed. He's usually a lot more like, gee, if you would just let me answer the question, or blah, blah, blah. It's embarrassing. Anyway, let's go on a little further.
Just trying to clear up what we heard today from the president, Peter. I'm sorry. We're trying to understand whether these tariffs are going to take effect next week.
Because I made it clear that what the president said, just go back and play the clip, and he gave you a timeline. The underlying issue there,
well, they said April 2nd, though, and we thought the deadline was March 4th.
The underlying issue, sir, is that too many Americans, anywhere from 50,000 on the low end to 300,000, which I think is the accurate number from the president, die every year from fentanyl that comes in from communist China in big chemical barrels. It goes to the drug cartels in Mexico, and the Mexican cartels then bring some of that up to Canada, and it comes across our border, and people either take it in the fentanyl direct form, or it's laced with other drugs like speed or heroin or whatever, and Americans are dying. So to the extent that that problem is going to be dealt with, I'm not in the center of those negotiations that being done by others in the administration. I would think as long as we have some progress, then we'll see what we will see. But it's up to the president. But the underlying the thing is, sir, it's like whenever I talk to people in the news about tariffs, they also want to cut to this chase over here about what's going to happen, or like they always raise the inflation, and they never ask why the tariffs. In this case, it's fentanyl's killing Americans. It's slaughter.
Well, we had a pretty good conversation with you about the why last time, Peter, and we understand the point of making this argument, but we just want to get some answers for our listeners and viewers about when these might take effect. This isn't about inflation, and it's not about the why. We just want to know when.
Asked and answered. I told you. You will go listen to what the president had to say. It's contingent on...
Anyway, I'm going to stop it there. Not that it's enjoyable, but it's just such a show watching this guy ramble and not be able to answer simple questions. He's asked later in this interview if the USA has the domestic capacity to make up shortfalls on specific commodities such as copper, and how quickly it can be ramped up to meet demand. And then he just says, quote, dumping from foreign overproduction is suppressing domestic development of new mines and smelting. To the extent that there is a plan, it is so contingent on unknown future factors. And here's another clip. I'll play another video clip. I just, in a way, really do hate watching this guy.
So you have been talking about the potential dangers of U.S. manufacturing moving offshore for a very long time, before the president was elected, largely on this issue. Is this the type of scenario you were worried about?
No, this is the type of scenario I was worried about on steroids. Let me talk about what I was looking at during the 2000s. I saw primarily the Chinese Communist Party engaged in all manner of unfair trade practices designed to take us apart and the world apart, whether it was sweatshop labor, pollution havens, massive subsidies, the use of state-owned enterprises to attack our sectors. What I was concerned about was the loss of our manufacturing base in smaller and medium-sized communities where they would be hollowed out, and we would be left with an economy which could not grow fast and which could not generate wage increases. And as a collateral damage, we would have a defense industrial base which simply could not defend us. Now, up to Donald Trump, that's exactly what we were getting, and all the opioid addiction and alcoholism and crime on top of that.
Well, I'd like to just kind of stay focused on COVID-19.
I love that. That interview was about the pandemic, and that was what he said instead. Again, the point here being the zealotry. This guy is so fixated on this. He goes on, I saw in the 2000s primarily the Communist Party of China's unfair trade practices designed to hollow out the U.S. It's truly an obsession. The last thing I'm going to play you from this is there was a debate that he did with a guy named Phil Potter 12 years ago. So Navarro has been getting this kind of feedback for a pretty long time, as this debate indicates. So essentially what this debate is about, it's from the Ford School of Public Policy, Peter Navarro and Phil Potter on U.S.-China relations, cooperation, or conflict. I thought this was actually a very interesting debate. Neither of these guys is a communist, but it was interesting just to hear another person interested in pursuing other strategies of pursuing U.S. interests that was pushing back on what Navarro was saying as like hysteria and very likely to not work at all, which is basically, the consensus that came out when they were unveiling the tariffs. Let me play you a bit from this. There's just a lot of interesting points. So Potter says, we're not in a position to dictate terms to China in the way that Navarro suggests, while still achieving U.S. strategic interests. I think that that's key. That kind of sums it up, which is what I find so peculiar about Navarro's entire position, is that China's beating us in every way conceivable. They have all these advantages, XYZ, so let's dictate terms. There's that scene, and I think it's The Dark Knight, where the guy working at Wayne Enterprises figures out that Bruce Wayne is probably Batman. And then he calls Lucius Fox in to tell him, I figured it out and I want, $100,000 a month and blah, blah, blah. And Fox says, so let me get this straight. You believe that your employer is a vigilante who goes around beating the shit out of people with his bare hands every night, unvanquished, and your plan is to blackmail this person? Maybe I haven't thought that through. But there's a similar ring to the kind of anti-China zealotry. It's like they're killing us across the board. We got to do something, and because they're just beating us in every conceivable way. And then the strategies that he rolls out to try to do something about it just seem like there's a real air of futility to it. It's something I find so odd. And why I called him such a strange figure is because it comes across in kind of every interview. The zealotry, but also the sort of hopelessness of it as well. Let's watch a little bit of this debate.
My name is Cynthia Rathanasamy, and I'm an MPP here at the Ford School, and I'll be your moderator today. So on behalf of ALSTAM, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of the Ford Policy Union debates.
All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We don't need all of it. But basically, this is from 2013, so Death by China was still a new popular documentary on Netflix at this time. And so she's introducing the two guests. And basically this guy, Potter, who is a lot less slick as a presenter, it's just interesting to hear this discussion in the context of what's been happening over the last few months with the tariffs, now that the raging nutcase on the left side of this, the presentation on the screen, now that he has power in the White House.
All right, so Dr. Potter, you have 12 minutes to go ahead with your opening statement.
Let's see if I've mastered this. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. So I am not a debater by training, so I will probably now break every rule and convention of that discipline. But here goes anyway. So what I'm going to argue is that the WTO is not the primary cause or China's entry to the WTO is not the primary cause of our current economic difficulties. And more generally, that we need to be taking a more nuanced view of the U.S.-China relationship than what is being proposed in this film that you're going to see a trailer for in a moment, and then I believe the full movie will show afterwards if you're interested in staying and taking a look at that. The reason for that is that at its core, China is now a major power, and we need to be taking seriously how we want to deal with China. We're not in a position to dictate terms in the way that I think this discussion suggests we could, and still achieve U.S. strategic interests. Right? By pursuing some of these kind of cracking down on China paths, we're actually likely to undermine our own self-interest. So, at its core, I really question sort of what this movie is for, right? It seems to be about sort of stirring up passions in the U.S., about exciting people for a certain course of political action. In a lot of ways, it strikes me as something that is very much at home in the current debates regarding the presidential election. But I see this as much more an inherently complex situation. And more than that oversimplifications of this kind are not benign, they're not clarifying, and they can in fact be dangerous. So the first reason for that, I think, is that this and a lot of arguments about the deficiencies of China in the international system sort of harken back to these good old days arguments, right? And I think one needs to be very careful about that in the US, right? And specifically, I'm referring to stories about how, in the 50s through the 70s, a man could have a blue-collar job and his wife could stay at home and they could have a car and life was good, right? First of all, household income in the U.S. was $25,000 adjusted for U.S. dollars now. It's roughly double that now. There are issues of inequality, some of which China has something to do with that we should be paying attention to, and I'll return to that in a minute. But I don't think that this is a cut and dry case where we want to be returning to the past, right? Second of all, that past was very much the product of a very odd historical moment in which we were coming out of World War II. We controlled half of the global GDP. Right? This is not something that's likely to be replicated. Okay? And so we need to start thinking about how we grapple with other major powers, other major economic powers, rather than cracking down on them. So the reason for this is, I think, is that blaming China is really pretty easy, right? But they're not fundamentally the problem. Manufacturing output in the US has actually been relatively consistent since the 1940s. That line is actually quite flat with some bouncing around the mean. Of course, the number of people employed in manufacturing has declined almost linearly over that same period. Okay? The reason for that is not China, right? It's machines, it's computers, it's productivity. Okay? Second of all, sorry, lost my train of thought there. Broke a debating rule, I'm sure. Second of all, manufacturing as a share of global GDP has also been in decline over this period. Right? And the share of U.S. GDP has gone right along with it. Again, much longer time series than you see with just China's entry into the WTO, and representing a broader global phenomenon that we need to be paying attention to. Right? Manufacturing just isn't the way to prosperity anymore. And this is sort of the fundamental thing that we're missing here. Both in the US and globally, the path forward is not through manufacturing. Okay? Finally, China's entry into the WTO, it's a singular event, right? It comes in 2001, late 2001 specifically, right? And pinning everything that's happened after that with all its complexities, with sort of US rises and declines, I think really washes out a lot of the information we want to know, okay? First of all, we entered a recession in 2001. Right, and when you look at maybe some of you have seen this, there's kind of a pretty graph that got kicked around pretty frequently with the decline in US jobs and manufacturing that seems to go down in 2001. I'd actually point to that same graph as evidence that something else is going on. China entered in late 2001. The trend is already falling off the cliff prior to that. Right, we have things like 9/11 in 2001. I could name any number of events in that period that could have important shifts, important effects on the US system, okay? So China's had some impact. I'm not trying to say that they've had no impact, but it's been dwarfed by larger shifts in the global economy. Specifically, I think points where Dr. Navarro is correct is that there are some issues with particular regard to intellectual property, with regard to property rights. Things that are not problems are things like currency manipulation. Just being in Beijing and talking to a lot of business leaders at the beginning of the summer, a lot of people in US business circles are concerned that if China floated its currency, it would go the other way, not the way that we are insisting in Congress that it's likely to go, okay? So part of the reason I think we need to be very careful about this, and that these are not just statements that are, in my opinion, factually incorrect, but are potentially damaging, are issues of unintended audiences, okay? I'm not trying to draw an overly strong parallel here, but we've seen what happens when you put movies out that reach the wrong people, right? And I'm specifically referring to this movie that we've been dealing with in the broader Middle East, which has enraged a lot of passions. Throughout this movie, Dr. Navarro has sort of caveats to say, well, you know, there's the big bad Chinese government, but we do love the Chinese people, okay? I would put forward to you that the Chinese people are not out of step with the government in this direction. If anything, Chinese people have lower opinions of US behavior, right, and would like to see the government take a stronger line against us, right? And this is something we need to be paying a fair amount of attention to, right? We assume on some level that at a popular level, if the Chinese government went away, then the Chinese people would be our friends. It's false, okay? On this same trip to Beijing, some Ford School students and I sat through a fairly lengthy diatribe by a member of the economics ministry who pointed out that the US is, sorry, I'm trying to think of a more civil word for it, ruining China's day because of control of the reserve currency, because of our control of international institutions, because of our control of an international system in which they were a latecomer, okay? And so what I want to say is that China's presence in the WTO is actually a very positive thing for the US, right? It brings China to the table, and it brings us into a conversation with China where otherwise we might be at direct loggerheads. That conversation doesn't always go well, doesn't always work smoothly, we don't always get what we want, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternatives, okay? So, rather than China exploiting us, I think it's much more productive to think of this in terms of a mutual hostage situation, okay? Yes, absolutely, China has an enormous amount of our debt. That's a problem, right? But this also poses substantial problems for China, right? It prevents efficient investment, right? It inflates, and on the U.S. side, it's inflated asset bubbles, okay? So, you know, this is not a good thing. It's something that both sides need to back off in a serious way, but that's done through conversation, right? In a mutual hostage situation, you can't dictate terms, okay? And I would posit that that is very much where we are. So the point that I'd like to make here is that Navarro's film is both sort of wrong and antiquated, and the real question is what we're going to do when China falls on hard times. Okay, this film is very much geared towards the US falling on hard times. But I think the real question for us is what happens when China falls on hard times. And I think that's likely to happen fairly soon. Inflation's very high. Some of these same issues we've talked about productive investment are coming home to roost. Right? From the Chinese perspective, they didn't kick us while we were down. Right? They did it in their own way, but they stimulated when we said they should stimulate. They played ball with the global system. Okay? And I think for a lot of Chinese people, the real test is going to come when it comes time for us to reciprocate. And what concerns me about movies like this and a lot of the dialogue that comes out of the presidential elections and out of the Congress is that the US is much more inclined to take advantage of the situation. And if you're going to take advantage of the situation, you better finish the job. Because this is a country that is gigantic in population, has an enormous amount going for it, and is likely to rebound regardless of what we do. And when they rebound, it's going to be a heck of a lot harder for the Chinese government to make the case to the Chinese people that they should be cooperating in a system that we designed and ran, and in many ways privilege our interests. Thanks.
Okay. So like I said, not a communist, but some rational pushback from the perspective of somebody arguing not to go nuclear with the fear-mongering and, cracking down type of approach on China. That, look, you can do all this hysteria about the communist nature of China. They're in the World Trade Organization. Like, you're there negotiating with them. Are you really thinking at this point in the U.S.'s history you're going to get better than that? Can you really expect you're going to keep just using pure force, just brute force against everybody you want to control? Is that going to work in this case, and so on? Well, now Navarro takes the podium to make his case, and then we'll watch the trailer for this thing I've been talking about. We'll go back to the chat and just sort of wrap this up. But I feel like this peek behind the curtain at the main tariff guy, this look inside Peter Navarro's brain, to me it explains all of the bullshit going on for the last few months of like why it doesn't seem to make a hell of a lot of sense. But this is the kind of voice that is being elevated in the Trump administration.
How y'all doing? Yeah? Last time I was at the U of M was literally 45 years ago, and I jumped out of a plane. It was weird. My brother went here, and he made me go skydiving. And this might be just the same kind of experience. The question before us is fairly simple. Is China's entry into the World Trade Organization responsible for the last 10 years, essentially, of the economic misery that we've endured here in the United States? That's the question. So let's stay focused just on that for a minute. If you look at the 5.5 decades prior to 2001, our gross domestic product in this country averaged 3.5%. And life was pretty good. Once we hit 2001, for the last 11 years now, that GDP growth rate has fallen to 1.6%, 3.5 to 1.6. Now, 2 percentage points, roughly, may not seem much, but 1% is 1 million jobs you don't create when you lose it. 2 a year for 10 years is about 20 million jobs. And that's about what we need right now to put everybody back to work. We have an unemployment rate which looks to be at 8.3, but for example, the unemployment rate dropped at the last report, but only because 400,000 people dropped out of the labor force. 400,000 people. By my estimate, and by the estimate of many economists, there's 25 million people in this country that can't find a decent job. Now, it's true that the forces of globalization started long before 2001. But something happened that year. You can blame it maybe on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can blame it on the war on terror. But the other elephant in the room
is China's entry into the World Trade Organization. If you look at the history of our economy, the problem in this last decade did not begin in 2007. Make no mistake about that. Here in Michigan, which was ground zero for the problem, the recession started back in 2001 and just kept going. Okay? There was never any recovery here. And you've got General Motors, one of the biggest corporations in the world now, saved by our government, offshoring not only its production to China, but also its research and development, which is where the new jobs come from. So something happened. If you look at the statistics, they're pretty simple, and you'll see them in the film. 50,000 factories gone. 6 million manufacturing jobs out of here. Now, this whole notion, which is common to academia, that you don't really need manufacturing base anymore. You don't need an industrial base. That we're all going to be running around in suits and life's going to be okay, really doesn't make sense. If you look, for example, at one of the strongest economies in the world, Germany, 25% of their women and men are in manufacturing. What do you think it is for us? What do you think? Take a number. 10, yeah, but it's 9 and still going down. Okay? And when I talk about manufacturing in America, I'm not talking about T-shirts. Well, they're gone forever to Honduras, and so be it. Great. But the difference between countries like Honduras and China is Honduras will buy our stuff, and probably they won't go to war with us. Okay? Now, here's the thing about the World Trade Organization. China joins it, and that would have been fine if they had done what they said they were going to do, which is play by the rules. Okay? What does that mean? It means no illegal export subsidies and respect for intellectual property. Now, since that time, because of weakness here in the U.S., they've broken every single rule in the book. The currency manipulation, which 40% advantage alone, okay, just on that. And then you'll see a wonderful scene in the film where this guy, Dan Slane, Bowling Green, Kentucky, 2002, because China got in, he was forced to move his furniture company over to China or go out of business, right? And so he's over there, and he makes stuff, and he makes it at cost, right? Ships it over here, dumps it over here, because businesses don't generally do stuff at cost, right? The way he made his profit, the Chinese government gave him a check every month for 17% of his revenues, okay? That's huge, okay? Now, the other thing what's interesting about the World Trade Organization is that it is absolutely silent on two things: worker abuses and environmental abuses. In other words, you can do anything you want to your workers or the environment. There's no ability to complain to the WTO. And the biggest flaw with the WTO is that you have to take it case by case by case, and any case that you file takes 3 or 4 years. And often by the time you get relief, the problem's gone. The factories that you were trying to save are gone. So this is a serious issue, and if the people of Michigan, if most of you are sons and daughters of the people of Michigan, I would assume, the people of Michigan can't understand how important manufacturing is by the fact that you see now what has happened, that it's gone and nothing's really replaced it, then we've got issues here in this country. Now, in terms of what needs to happen going forward, I really think we need to talk about whether this country needs to be in the World Trade Organization at all. I mean, if you think about what it is, I remember when I was shooting the film.
So just to jump in here, this is, again, the sort of hardline, quote, anti-globalist thing. Well, what if the U.S., because it's not getting literally everything it could ever want ever, just withdraws from the WTO? Buddy, the U.S. helped set that up, and you're just now getting some major pushback or, some competition, and they can't handle it. But this is generally the way that you see the Republican Party in particular handling any challenge to their power. It's victimization, it's persecution, it's we're being cheated after the U.S. as a whole has been absolutely fucking over the world in some of the most dishonorable, I don't even know what to call it, like some of the just most low down, dirty, disgusting ways conceivable. Now they're playing the victim as soon as there's any competitor who isn't even engaging in abuses nearly as egregious. It only got 99.97% of what it wants instead of the whole 100%. Time to pack up and go home. Anyway, this guy would probably be the most annoying professor to have in a college classroom you could possibly have. I think in this video, actually, they don't... I said we would watch the trailer. Oh, no, here it is. Here it is. Yeah, let's watch this.
I was laid off 3 times within 6 months until I was permanently laid off.
I graduated with my bachelor's and I haven't been able to find anything.
Jobs disappear. And the way the economy's going right now, it's tough to find a job.
When the workers in China are being abused, then workers in America have a tougher time competing against them.
5.5 million manufacturing jobs are gone.
57,000 manufacturing facilities closed in this nation.
Some of the workers at companies, literally their last act at the factory was to unbolt the machine and load it up to be shipped off to China.
There's no question that a large part of China's competitive advantage has come from environmental neglect.
16 of the world's 20th dirtiest cities are located in the People's Republic.
That leads to carbon emissions and particulate matter falling all along the coast of the United States.
If you put it in your mouth or the hands of a child, don't buy it from China.
They're not only ruining our economy, they're poisoning our children with the toys that we give them.
China until today is a totalitarian regime, is a dynasty, not republic, not people's country.
China's military power is strengthening very, very rapidly.
It's developing a modern, well-equipped, technologically capable military.
China is the only major nation in the world that is preparing to kill Americans.
We're a subsidiary of China and getting worse and worse because they're going to own us pretty soon.
If we talk about who's to blame, I think partially our own government.
Our government should be doing something.
They could have stepped in, I think, a long time ago.
Please hear us.
I think that at every level, people could boycott and there would be a shot heard around the world.
So yeah, narrated by Martin Sheen, by the way, of The West Wing. Did the China boycott work, by the way? This was 2012. I don't think it did. Let's continue on a little bit with the video because I actually enjoy some of Potter's comments about it.
Dr. Potter, you have 5 minutes for your response statement.
Okay. So maybe we should have started with that because it gives us, I think, a better idea of why this movie sort of alarms me a little bit. I would say it's alarmist, right? I mean, images of World War II looking jets replace Asian people here with Chinese, carpet bombing the U.S., a Bowie knife, blood dripping out of the continental United States. I mean, you know, maybe alarmist is not the right word, but I might one-up it, okay? So, you know, Dr. Navarro gave us some really touching anecdotes, but then challenged us to look at the numbers a little bit, okay? So I would say, let's start there. Let's look at the numbers, all right? This supposed cutoff in 2001, right, where you have over 3% growth prior to that, 1.6% growth after that. So, you know, here at the Ford School, we like to do a fair bit of analysis. I think they should be well within your reach. What happens to those numbers if we shift the cutoff to 2000? You still have high on one side, low on the other. If we cut it to 2005, or better yet, 8, right? You have negative on the one side and positive on the other, right? So my point is this supposedly smoking gun cutoff at 2001 is arbitrary, okay? And it looks compelling if you sort of say that the numbers on one side or the other, but that is not smoking gun evidence. That's not what smoking gun evidence looks like. In general, China has consistently lagged behind the US several steps on the value chain. Okay, and so this is part of the problem with the story that China is taking American jobs, right? China's comparative advantage, despite what's been claimed here, is actually low-cost labor. Okay, that's what they've got. They've got people. This isn't terribly complicated. Okay, unfortunately, and I think the Foxconn example is a great pointer for this. That's been changing. Right? China's been having a lot of problems recently because they're having trouble competing on price for the lowest cost labor, which are jobs they took from the rest of the developing world, not from us. Right? They're having trouble competing on price for labor, and they're having a really tough time moving up the value chain to the kind of things that we do well. Okay? And this is what really concerns me about this story we keep hearing, that we need to be returning to manufacturing. Right? The Chinese are desperately trying to figure out how to get the heck out of manufacturing. Okay? It makes very little sense for us to turn around and say, that's what we need to be doing. Okay? The Germany example, I think, is a really good one. All right? Germany's in the WTO. Right? Why is Germany doing, given the facts that have been presented, why is Germany doing well and the US doing not? It's the type of manufacturing that matters. Okay? China has not been doing that sort of the high-tech machining, that sort of work that the Germans have long been very good at. Right? And certainly it is true that having some manufacturing sector, the right kind of manufacturing sector, a German-style manufacturing sector, is good for your security interests. Those are capabilities you want to have. But these blanket statements about steel mills being hollowed out in Youngstown or wherever it might be are again, missing the larger point. That's enough.
Cool. All right. We'll leave it there for now. It's getting like super late anyway. But this is the guy. And you can see him, back when he was 12 or 13 years younger, a lot more pep in his step. But this is the guy who is Trump's tariff czar. And this is what he has been doing with his life, is writing books titled Death by China. The entire series, Crouching Tiger, about, hyping up the threat of Chinese militarism. And it is such fear-mongering. Again, that guy, his debate opponent here is not a communist. He's just saying, like, look, even from the perspective of U.S. interests as a competitor, economic competitor with China, like, what you're saying makes no fucking sense. And that's basically what we're hearing today as well. So anyway, I just thought it was timely going back to this for some earlier context.